Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for dropping by. So, my name's Sam. I'm with vNova. We're one of the primary companies behind the new MPEG 5 LCEVC standard. Just to quickly check, how many of you are familiar with LCEVC already? 50%. 2 out of 4. So that's great. I'm actually today going to just cover a lesser known application of LCEVC to give people are familiar with it. LCEVC is mostly used for enhancing normal codecs just to give better quality, higher resolutions and lower processing costs, but it can also be used for other things including HDR. So just to quickly introduce you then to what LCEVC actually is, fairly obviously it's an MPEG standard, was ratified last year. The unique thing about LCEVC is that as opposed to being a standalone video codec like your H.264 HEVCs of the world, it's actually an enhancement to all of those, so it doesn't compete with any of the other codecs. It's actually an optional add-on to improve any of them. And it's low complexity, which means a couple of things. It's very easy to deploy on many devices, just with software updates, because you don't need, in most cases, any dedicated hardware to decode the enhancement piece. And also on the encoding or transcoding side, the fact that it's low complexity means you can really reduce your processing costs and also the amount of compute and energy that you're using to run those workflows, which if you're interested in getting to more sustainable delivery, it's a great way to help with that. So to give you a quick idea of how it typically works, and you'll see the HDR use case I'm going to talk about is a little bit different. But a lot of the sort of processing gains you get from LCEVC are as a result of using the base codec that it's enhancing. It uses that codec at a lower resolution, typically a quarter of the resolution you're actually targeting. And then LCEVC applies smart upscaling to get to your target resolution, for example, going from SD to HD. Perhaps, and that smart upscaling gets you to where you're going with as little error in the upscale as possible. And then LCEVC also encodes all of the extra detail, all of the sort of higher frequency spatial detail that will not be present from the upscale, and that way you get a full resolution reconstruction of the frame. And to overview the sort of highlights of the benefits that you get from deploying LCEVC on a transcoding workflow. First of all, better compression efficiency. So with AVC or H.264, you're typically getting 40 to 50% benefits, so the same quality at 40 or 50% lower bit rates. And you can see those compression benefits change slightly with the more advanced, more recent codecs. So if you go all the way to sort of VVC, it's more like a 15 or 20% compression efficiency gain. But at the same time, the processing benefits get higher and higher. So if you are transcoding using VVC or AV1, for example, then you're probably speeding up your encoding pipeline by 3 or even 4x in many cases. And so the energy consumption and the feasibility of actually rolling out those new codecs is really improved. And finally, LCEVC can also help a lot with low latency workflows because of the low complexity approach and the tools that are in LCEVC, rather than the usual case where you're turning off lots of compression tools to get to low latency. And obviously compromising on quality. With LCEVC you can get that quality back up without impacting the latency, and it's compatible with WebRTC, and all of the other low latency protocols that are around today. So, moving on to the topic in hand, which is HDR. So, just to cover really the situation with HDR distribution today, I'm sure we're all getting used to sort of major service offerings now where you've got quite a lot of content for Netflix, YouTube, so on. There's a decent amount of HDR content that you can watch on smart TVs, certainly. The sort of the areas that are more behind are in particular broadcast, where provision for HDR in broadcast distribution is only just emerging. There was a great announcement by Sinclair a couple of days ago where they're starting to do so. But it's very clear in broadcast that the key challenge is that you really need a single backwards compatible workflow to distribute HDR without having to do completely standalone HDR channels that can only be received by particular receivers. And then if we look at the rest of the world of devices, mobile and tablet and so on, in that area, the support for on the devices to actually render HDR streams is much more fragmented, and that's holding things back. So really the barriers to pushing HDR further and getting it out to more eyeballs, I think these are the three key areas. Firstly, content. I'm sure we're all probably aware that filming and production with HDR does add some new costs and some new processes. But it's been around long enough now that I think this isn't a major barrier anymore. In the area of linear content or live content, that's where the challenges are once again more obvious, where you really need to have unified SDR and HDR, high dynamic range workflows to be able to do production that you can serve to all endpoints. Device support, as I touched on, is certainly a barrier to pushing this along more quickly. There is good support in TVs, but other devices are a little less well covered, as we mentioned with mobile and so on. There's still a very relevant, massive bulk of devices out there that only support H.264 or even older codec decoding, which for the most part, because H.264 doesn't really support HDR at all, it forces, if you want to address those devices, you need to deliver an SDR stream and an HDR stream and have two completely separate workflows or simulcasting. And also HEVC has been the obvious codec to use for HDR distribution, at least over the last few years. There are more emerging options now, and the licensing issues around royalties with HEVC have certainly prevented some taking that up, and that's particularly apparent in the sort of mobile space, where the total royalty exposure is much higher. And then there's cost, of course. So touched on production costs. There are some costs associated with doing HDR, and distribution costs can be a lot higher if you are indeed forced to run two completely parallel workflows for SDR and HDR. I just thought I'd bring up this good diagram. It's probably a little bit small for some of you to see, but with HDR standards there and device support, they are quite focused around the TV space, and there are different HDR standards. There's quite a lot of overlap between some of them, but they are, there are a few competing ones out there. But yeah, it sort of makes the point that this is the picture of sort of HDR standards and support, and it's very, very centered around TVs at present, and it would be great to be able to get to those other devices. So LCEVC can help with some of this, and just to give you a sort of quick introduction as to why. We talked about the usual use case with LCEVC being just to improve the quality and processing cost of your normal OTT streaming using a quarter resolution base. But actually LCEVC is quite a flexible standard that can carry different types of enhancement. For one thing, it can carry different bit depths of enhancement. 10 is the obvious one, but it can also go, it can do 12 and even 14-bit enhancement. And so in that space, it can carry a 10-bit HDR encoding and signaling on top of an 8-bit base codec. So with H.264 AVC as a base codec, you can actually encode a 10-bit HDR. And then there are other examples as well for sort of cloud rendering use cases or frankly any other user data. You know, there's potential for other use cases to emerge in future with the standard. So two key sort of scenarios where LCEVC can certainly help with HDR. The first really big one is in broadcast. So by definition, with LCEVC enhancing an 8-bit base codec AVC with a 10-bit HDR enhancement layer, you get that single delivery format that can go to any receiver. So receivers that haven't been enabled with LCEVC decoding would still take the SDR 8-bit base and decode it as they always have done. And any LCEVC, so any new set-top box, for example, or any receiver can decode the full HDR signal. And because of the compression benefits as well, you wouldn't need any extra bandwidth beyond what's already deployed for the channel. And then similarly in the multi-screen OTT world, once again you can create a single transcoding delivery system for SDR, traditional 8-bit, and HDR, and you have that backwards compatible SDR stream as part of it. And there is within that quite a lot of potential to enable HDR on devices that have never really displayed it before. There are rendering requirements on the device, but there are some AVC devices out there which do have that capability but cannot decode a 10-bit, traditionally haven't been able to decode a 10-bit HDR signal, and LCEVC can enable that. So just a couple of quick things. There has actually been quite a lot of academic research into this area using LCEVC. This is one paper that was done for the recent Mile High Video conference, evaluating 10-bit LCEVC on top of an 8-bit X.264 base for PQ and HLG delivery. The LCEVC side is actually compatible with all of the HDR standards. And in this case, the quality was shown to be equivalent or slightly better with LCEVC enhanced H.264 versus the 10-bit X.265 encode. So that really just proved, with some thorough objective testing that the use case does indeed work. And then this one is slightly different, but just looking at perhaps the standard use case of LCEVC for improving the compression efficiency and processing costs associated with delivery. So this is looking at a 10-bit VVC transcode for PQ and HLG, and comparing that with an LCEVC enhanced VVC, also 10-bit in the same way. And at these, in this use case, actually LCEVC was delivering over a 50% compression of efficiency gain, so really made a big difference in this analysis. So finally, just to wrap up, just wanted to draw your attention to the growing ecosystem of solutions for MPEG 5 LCEVC. There's now a sort of a growing world of encoders from the likes of Harmonic, Main Concept, Videon. We have a big presence in players. There are a number of end-to-end platforms as well, sort of low latency and more conventional OTT platforms, and also growing presence among and support from some of the chipset manufacturers who are looking to, despite the ability to deploy LCEVC in software, are looking to deploy dedicated hardware to fully realize the benefits of the standard. And supporting all of that as well, there's a flourishing open source ecosystem of solutions, particularly in the player space. So all of these and a few more important players like EXO Player or Shaka Player, we have reference integrations of LCEVC enabled versions of those, and some of these solutions are going back into these open source projects as well. Ffmpeg, of course, is a really important one. Within the Ffmpeg ecosystem, there's support for LCEVC enhanced versions of over a dozen base codecs. Things like X264, X265, NVENC from NVIDIA, and so on and so forth. And if you're interested in checking out any of those, any of the sort of commercial solutions or the open source bits and pieces, please visit us on the LCEVC showcase stand, which is only about 50 meters that way, and we'd be really happy to show you some more about it. So, thank you very much.